Welcome to a journey through 2 hours of fascinating psychological mechanisms that operate beneath your conscious awareness every single day. Tonight, as you prepare to drift into peaceful sleep, you will discover the invisible forces that shape your thoughts, influence your decisions, and guide your behaviors in ways you never imagined. Your brain constantly uses hidden shortcuts and automatic processes while you make what seem like independent choices. These scientifically documented phenomena reveal how your mind actually works beyond what most people understand about human psychology. You will learn about powerful effects like anchoring that makes first impressions override later evidence, false memory creation that convinces you of experiences that never happened, and emotional contagion that spreads feelings between people like invisible infections. These mechanisms evolved to help humans survive, but in our modern world, they can sometimes work against your interests, making you vulnerable to manipulation and poor decisions. Understanding these psychological truths helps you develop greater awareness of your mental processes so you can make more informed choices. So adjust your pillows, dim the lights, and prepare to discover the hidden psychology that reveals how wonderfully mysterious the human mind truly is. 1. The anchoring effect and first impressions. The anchoring effect represents one of the most powerful yet invisible forces that shape every decision you make throughout your day. When your mind encounters the very first piece of information about anything, whether it is a price tag, a person's appearance, or a random number someone mentions, that initial detail becomes an anchor that weighs down all your subsequent judgments like a heavy chain dropped into the ocean of your consciousness. Your brain, seeking efficiency in its endless processing tasks, uses this first impression as a reference point, and everything else gets compared to this mental anchor, whether you realize it or not. Consider how this mechanism operates. When you walk into a store and see a shirt priced at $200 right at the entrance, even if you never intended to buy that expensive shirt, its price becomes anchored in your mind, making the $70 shirt you encounter later seem like a reasonable bargain. Your perception of value has been fundamentally altered by that first anchor point, and your decision-making process now operates within the framework established by that initial information. This psychological trick extends far beyond shopping experiences into every realm of human interaction and judgment. When you meet someone new, the first details you notice about their appearance, speech, or behavior create powerful anchors that influence how you interpret everything else about them. A person wearing professional attire will be perceived differently than someone in casual clothes, even if they say identical words and display the same personality traits. The anchoring effect reveals how your supposedly rational mind actually operates through a series of unconscious shortcuts that can be easily influenced by those who understand this hidden mechanism of human psychology. 2. Classical conditioning in everyday habits. Classical conditioning flows through your daily existence like an invisible river, shaping your responses, emotions, and behaviors in ways that would astonish you if you could see them clearly. This fundamental learning mechanism, first discovered through experiments with dogs and bells, operates continuously in your own life, creating automatic responses that bypass your conscious decision-making entirely. Your brain naturally pairs neutral experiences with meaningful ones, gradually building a network of unconscious triggers that can instantly shift your mood, appetite, or state of mind without any deliberate thought on your part. Think about how your body responds when you hear your morning alarm clock. That particular sound has become so strongly associated with the need to wake up that it can trigger stress responses even when you hear it during the day. The neutral tone has been conditioned to produce an automatic physiological reaction through repeated pairing with the experience of being abruptly pulled from sleep. Similarly, certain songs can instantly transport you back to specific memories and emotional states because they became paired with significant experiences during their formation. The food industry expertly exploits classical conditioning by pairing their products with positive experiences, attractive imagery, and pleasant emotions through advertising. That particular combination of colors, sounds, and imagery in a fast food commercial has been carefully designed to trigger hunger and craving responses that feel completely natural to you. Your local coffee shop understands this principle too, which is why they work so hard to create consistent sensory experiences that become paired with feelings of comfort and satisfaction. Over time, even the smell of coffee or the sight of their logo can trigger automatic responses that draw you back, demonstrating how classical conditioning operates as a powerful but largely invisible force that shapes your daily choices and behaviors. 3. The halo effect in social judgment. The halo effect casts a golden glow over your perception of others, creating a beautiful but distorted lens through which you view people and situations. When you encounter someone who possesses one obviously positive trait, your mind unconsciously assumes they must also possess other positive qualities, even though logic tells you these traits are completely unrelated. This cognitive bias operates like a luminous halo that spreads its radiance across your entire impression of a person, influencing judgments about their character, competence, and trustworthiness in ways that bypass rational evaluation. Imagine meeting someone who is strikingly attractive and well-dressed. Without any conscious intention, your mind begins attributing other positive qualities to them. You might assume they are more intelligent, kinder, more successful, or more trustworthy than average, simply because your brain has linked their physical appeal with these unrelated characteristics. Research consistently demonstrates that attractive individuals receive more favorable treatment in job interviews, court proceedings, and social interactions, not because they are actually more competent or moral, but because the halo effect influences how others perceive and respond to them. This psychological mechanism extends beyond personal attractiveness into every domain where you encounter excellence or expertise. A brilliant scientist might be assumed to have wisdom about politics or relationships, even though their expertise lies purely in their specialized field. A successful business leader might be credited with deep insights into education or social policy, simply because the halo of their business success creates an illusion of general competence. Understanding the halo effect reveals how your supposedly objective judgments are actually colored by irrelevant positive impressions that create systematic biases in how you perceive and interact with the world around you. 4. False memory creation and reconstruction. Your memory operates more like a creative storyteller than a precise recording device, constantly weaving together fragments of actual experience with imagination, suggestion, and reconstruction to create what feels like accurate recollections of the past. False memories can be implanted so seamlessly into your consciousness that they become indistinguishable from genuine experiences. complete with vivid sensory details and emotional resonance that convince you of their authenticity. This malleability of memory reveals a dark truth about human psychology. Your most cherished recollections might be partially or completely fabricated, yet they feel entirely real and shape your identity just as powerfully as any genuine experience. The creation of false memories often begins with seemingly innocent suggestions or leading questions that plant seeds in your mind. A therapist might ask if you remember being afraid of water as a child, and if you cannot recall such an experience, they might suggest that perhaps you have repressed the memory. Over time, through repeated questioning and guided imagery exercises, you might begin to construct vivid recollections of nearly drowning or being forced into water against your will. These memories can become so detailed and emotionally charged that you would stake your life on their accuracy, even though they are complete fabrications created through the interaction of suggestion and imagination. The legal system has been particularly impacted by the discovery of false memory creation. As eyewitness testimony once considered the gold standard of evidence has been revealed to be surprisingly unreliable. Leading questions from investigators, media coverage of crimes, and discussions with other witnesses can all contribute to the creation of false memories that feel completely authentic to those who experience them. Understanding how easily memories can be manipulated and reconstructed offers a sobering glimpse into the fluid nature of human consciousness and raises profound questions about the reliability of our most fundamental sense of self and experience. 5. Social proof and crowd influence. Social proof operates as an invisible magnet that pulls your behavior into alignment with those around you, creating a powerful psychological current that can sweep you along with the crowd, even when it contradicts your personal beliefs or preferences. This fundamental human tendency to look to others for guidance about appropriate behavior evolved as a survival mechanism, helping our ancestors navigate complex social situations and avoid dangerous mistakes by following the wisdom of the group. However, in modern society, this same mechanism can be exploited to manipulate your choices and actions in ways that serve the interests of others rather than your own best judgment. The power of social proof reveals itself most clearly in situations where you feel uncertain about the correct course of action. When you see a long line of people waiting outside a restaurant, you automatically assume the food must be exceptional, even though the crowd might have formed for completely unrelated reasons. Online retailers understand this psychology perfectly, which is why they prominently display customer reviews, purchase numbers, and popularity rankings to create the impression that many others have chosen their products. The simple phrase, "most popular choice," can significantly increase sales because it triggers your innate desire to follow social proof. This mechanism becomes particularly dangerous in crowd situations where individual responsibility becomes diffused among the group. The bystander effect demonstrates how people are less likely to help someone in need when others are present, because each person assumes someone else will take action. Similarly, online harassment campaigns often escalate because participants feel protected by the anonymity and perceived approval of the crowd. Understanding social proof reveals how your seemingly independent choices are constantly influenced by subtle cues about what others are doing, thinking, and preferring, making you far more susceptible to manipulation than you might ever imagine. 6. The Zeigarnik effect of unfinished tasks. The Zeigarnik effect creates a persistent mental tension that keeps unfinished tasks circling through your consciousness like restless spirits that refuse to be laid to rest. Your brain possesses a remarkable tendency to remember incomplete activities far more vividly and persistently than completed ones, creating an internal pressure that continues to demand attention long after you have moved on to other activities. This psychological mechanism evolved as a way to ensure important tasks would not be forgotten, but in modern life, it can become a source of chronic mental stress and distraction that undermines your peace of mind and ability to focus on present moment experiences. Think about how an interrupted conversation continues to occupy your thoughts throughout the day, or how an unfinished project seems to generate its own gravitational field that pulls your attention back repeatedly. Your mind maintains active memory traces for incomplete tasks, keeping them in a state of heightened accessibility that makes them more likely to pop into consciousness at random moments. This is why you might suddenly remember an unfinished email while taking a shower, or find yourself thinking about an incomplete work assignment during a social gathering. The entertainment industry has masterfully exploited the Zeigarnik effect through cliffhangers, serialized storytelling, and interactive media that create psychological loops demanding resolution. Television shows end episodes at moments of maximum tension, specifically to ensure that viewers will experience the discomfort of incomplete narrative resolution until the next episode airs. Video games and social media platforms use similar techniques, creating endless streams of unfinished challenges, notifications, and social interactions that keep users psychologically engaged and returning for more. Understanding the Zeigarnik effect reveals how your mind can be trapped in cycles of incomplete resolution that prevent you from experiencing the satisfaction and peace that comes from true completion. 7. Subliminal perception and hidden messages. Subliminal perception operates below the threshold of your conscious awareness, allowing information to enter your mind and influence your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors without you ever realizing that any external input has occurred. This invisible channel of influence works through stimuli that are too brief, too quiet, or too subtle for conscious detection, yet still register in the deeper layers of your cognitive processing system. The existence of subliminal perception reveals a disturbing truth about human consciousness. Your mind is constantly being shaped by influences that you cannot see, hear, or consciously recognize, making you vulnerable to manipulation that operates entirely outside your awareness and control. Research has demonstrated that images flashed for mere milliseconds can influence subsequent judgments and preferences, even though viewers have no memory of seeing anything unusual. Words or phrases embedded in background audio at volumes below conscious detection can still activate related concepts in your mind, subtly shifting your thoughts and associations in directions that serve the purposes of whoever planted those hidden messages. This influence occurs through pathways in your brain that process information automatically, bypassing the critical thinking and conscious evaluation that you rely on to make informed decisions. The advertising industry has long been fascinated by subliminal techniques, experimenting with hidden messages, embedded imagery, and subtle sensory manipulations designed to influence consumer behavior without triggering conscious resistance. While dramatic claims about subliminal advertising may be exaggerated, the basic principle remains sound. Your mind can be influenced by stimuli, that exist below the threshold of consciousness, creating preferences and responses that feel like natural choices, but actually result from hidden manipulation. Understanding subliminal perception highlights the importance of recognizing that your thoughts and preferences may not be as independent and self-determined as you believe, and that maintaining awareness of these invisible influences is essential for preserving your cognitive autonomy. 8. The Benjamin Franklin effect. The Benjamin Franklin effect reveals a counterintuitive truth about human psychology. When someone does a favor for you, they actually become more likely to like you, rather than less likely, completely contradicting our usual assumptions about the direction of cause and effect in relationships. This phenomenon demonstrates how your mind constantly works to maintain internal consistency between your actions and beliefs, creating a psychological pressure that reshapes your attitudes to align with your behavior rather than the other way around. Understanding this effect provides insight into how relationships develop and how influence operates through the subtle manipulation of small actions that gradually shift underlying attitudes and feelings. The mechanism behind this effect lies in your brain's need to resolve cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension that arises when your actions conflict with your beliefs or attitudes. When you perform a favor for someone you feel neutral or even slightly negative about, your mind experiences a subtle form of psychological discomfort, because helping behavior typically occurs between people who like each other. To resolve this internal contradiction, your brain automatically adjusts your attitude toward the person, generating more positive feelings that justify the helpful action you have already taken. Benjamin Franklin himself discovered this principle when dealing with a political rival who had publicly criticized him. Rather than trying to win the man over through grand gestures or arguments, Franklin simply asked to borrow a rare book from the man's library. After the rival agreed and lent him the book, their relationship improved dramatically, and the former critic became a lifelong friend and supporter. This story illustrates how small requests for assistance can be more powerful than elaborate attempts at persuasion or relationship building, because they activate the fundamental human need to maintain consistency between actions and attitudes. The Benjamin Franklin effect demonstrates that influence often works backwards from what we expect, with behavior changes leading to attitude changes rather than the reverse. 9. Cognitive dissonance and mental comfort. Cognitive dissonance creates an uncomfortable psychological tension that arises whenever your beliefs, attitudes, or values come into conflict with each other or with your actual behavior, generating a mental pressure that demands resolution through some form of internal adjustment. This fundamental aspect of human psychology operates like an internal alarm system that alerts you to inconsistencies in your thinking. But rather than encouraging you to examine these contradictions objectively, it typically motivates you to find ways to reduce the discomfort through rationalization, denial, or selective attention that preserves your existing worldview while minimizing psychological stress. When you hold to contradictory beliefs simultaneously, or when your actions contradict your stated values, your mind experiences a form of internal friction that feels genuinely uncomfortable and demands immediate attention. For example, if you consider yourself an environmentally conscious person but continue to drive a gas-guzzling vehicle, the contradiction between your identity and behavior creates cognitive dissonance that must be resolved somehow. Rather than changing the behavior to match the belief, most people find it easier to rationalize the contradiction by emphasizing the necessity of the car for work, the impracticality of alternatives, or the minimal impact of individual choices on global environmental problems. This psychological mechanism makes people remarkably resistant to information that challenges their established beliefs and surprisingly creative in finding ways to explain away contradictory evidence. Political partisans will dismiss unfavorable facts about their preferred candidates, while enthusiastically embracing identical information about their opponents. Religious believers will rationalize contradictions between their faith and scientific evidence, rather than questioning their fundamental assumptions. Understanding cognitive dissonance reveals how your mind prioritizes psychological comfort over objective truth, making it essential to actively cultivate intellectual humility and willingness to question your own beliefs if you want to maintain any semblance of objectivity in your thinking and decision-making. 10. The method of loci memory palace. The method of loci transforms your spatial memory into a powerful storage and retrieval system by associating information you want to remember with specific locations in a familiar physical space, creating what ancient scholars called a memory palace. This technique exploits your brain's remarkable ability to remember spatial relationships and navigate familiar environments, linking abstract information to concrete physical locations that can be mentally revisited whenever you need to recall the stored material. The method works by transforming the challenge of remembering disconnected facts or concepts into the much easier task of taking a mental walk through a space you know intimately, picking up information that has been deliberately placed along your predetermined route. To create your own memory palace, you begin by selecting a location you know extremely well, such as your childhood home, your current workplace, or your daily commute route. You then establish a specific path through this space, identifying distinct locations where you will deposit the information you want to remember. As you mentally traverse this path, you place each piece of information at a specific location, often creating vivid, unusual, or emotionally charged mental images that make the associations more memorable and easier to retrieve later. The power of this technique lies in its exploitation of multiple memory systems simultaneously. Your spatial memory, which evolved to help humans navigate complex environments, provides a robust framework for organizing information. Your visual memory allows you to create detailed mental images that serve as retrieval cues. Your episodic memory, which naturally remembers sequences of events and experiences, helps you maintain the narrative structure of your mental journey through the palace. Professional memory competitors use elaborate versions of this technique to memorize thousands of random numbers, entire books, or complex sequences of information that would overwhelm normal memory capacity. Understanding the method of loci reveals how your memory systems can be deliberately trained and optimized through techniques that work with, rather than against, your brain's natural information processing preferences. 11. Emotional contagion between people. Emotional contagion operates as an invisible transmission system that allows feelings to spread from person to person through unconscious mimicry and automatic nervous system responses, creating a shared emotional climate that can dramatically influence your mood, behavior, and decision-making without any conscious awareness of the process. This phenomenon occurs through multiple channels simultaneously, including facial expressions, body language, vocal tones, and even subtle physiological cues that your nervous system detects and automatically begins to mirror. The result is that emotions literally become contagious, spreading through groups and social networks in ways that parallel the transmission of infectious diseases. But operating on the level of psychological and physiological states rather than biological pathogens, the mechanism of emotional contagion begins with your natural tendency to unconsciously mimic the expressions and behaviors of others around you. When you see someone smile, microscopic muscles in your own face begin to activate in a similar pattern, and this physical mimicry triggers corresponding emotional responses in your own nervous system. Similarly, when you hear someone speaking in an agitated or anxious tone, your own vocal apparatus begins to subtly match their patterns. And this physical matching creates internal emotional resonance that makes you feel more agitated or anxious yourself. This automatic emotional synchronization serves important social functions by helping groups coordinate their responses to threats or opportunities. But it also makes you vulnerable to manipulation by those who understand how to deliberately broadcast specific emotional states. Skilled public speakers, performers, and leaders learn to project desired emotions that will spread throughout their audience, creating shared experiences of excitement, fear, anger, or inspiration that serve their purposes. Similarly, negative emotions can spread just as easily, which is why spending time with chronically depressed, anxious, or angry people often leaves you feeling drained and emotionally dysregulated. Understanding emotional contagion reveals the importance of being selective about your social environment and developing awareness of how others' emotional states influence your own internal experience. 12. The decoy effect in decision-making. The decoy effect manipulates your decision-making process by introducing a deliberately inferior option that makes a preferred choice appear more attractive by comparison, exploiting your mind's tendency to evaluate options relatively rather than assessing their absolute value independently. This psychological manipulation works by presenting 3 choices instead of 2, with the third option designed to be obviously worse than one of the original options in most respects, but similar enough to highlight the advantages of the preferred choice. The result is that people become significantly more likely to choose the option that the decoy was designed to promote, even though their actual preferences and needs have not changed at all. Consider how this technique operates in subscription services that offer 3 tiers of pricing. The basic plan might cost $10 per month with limited features, while the premium plan costs $30 with extensive features. Most people would carefully weigh whether the premium features justify the additional cost. However, when a middle option is introduced at $25 with only slightly more features than the basic plan, the premium option suddenly appears to offer exceptional value by comparison. The middle option serves as a decoy that exists primarily to make the expensive option look reasonable, and subscription rates for the premium service increase dramatically, even though nothing about the premium service itself has changed. This manipulation technique appears throughout consumer marketing, political campaigning, and any situation where someone wants to influence your choices while maintaining the illusion that you are making independent decisions. Real estate agents will show you overpriced houses that they never intend to sell, specifically to make their preferred properties appear more attractive by comparison. Political candidates will highlight extreme positions held by their opponents to make their own more moderate positions appear reasonable and appealing. Understanding the decoy effect reveals how your supposedly rational decision making process can be systematically manipulated through the strategic presentation of options designed to influence your choices rather than genuinely expand your alternatives. 13. Learned helplessness and passive behavior. Learned helplessness develops when repeated exposure to uncontrollable negative experiences teaches your mind that resistance is futile, creating a psychological state of passive resignation that persists even when opportunities for escape or improvement become available. This profound form of conditioning can override your natural survival instincts and problem-solving abilities, leaving you trapped in situations that you actually have the power to change, simply because past experiences have convinced your unconscious mind that action is pointless. The mechanism operates through a gradual erosion of your sense of personal agency and efficacy, replacing natural responses of fight or flight with a learned pattern of submission and endurance. The classic experiments that revealed this phenomenon involved animals that were initially subjected to inescapable electric shocks, then later placed in situations where escape was possible but not attempted, because the animals had learned that their actions made no difference to their circumstances. This same pattern appears in human psychology when people remain in abusive relationships, tolerate unfair working conditions, or fail to pursue opportunities for improvement, not because they lack the ability to change their circumstances, but because previous experiences have taught them that their efforts will not succeed. The insidious nature of learned helplessness lies in its self-perpetuating quality. Once you have internalized the belief that you are powerless to change your circumstances, you stop looking for opportunities and solutions that might actually be available, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that reinforces the original sense of helplessness. This psychological trap can affect entire populations through systemic oppression, economic inequality, or cultural messages that discourage individual agency and initiative. Understanding learned helplessness reveals how past experiences can create invisible psychological barriers that prevent you from recognizing and acting upon genuine opportunities for positive change, making it essential to consciously challenge assumptions about your own capabilities and the possibilities available in your current circumstances. 14. The mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect demonstrates how repeated contact with anything gradually increases your preference and positive feelings toward it, regardless of whether that initial exposure was pleasant, neutral, or even slightly negative. This fundamental psychological principle operates below conscious awareness, creating familiarity that your brain interprets as safety and desirability without any logical evaluation of the object as actual merits or value. The effect works through pure repetition, gradually shifting your emotional response from neutral or negative toward increasingly positive, simply because familiar things feel safer and more comfortable than unfamiliar ones, reflecting deep evolutionary programming that associates familiarity with survival and novelty with potential danger. This mechanism explains why songs that initially annoyed you on the radio eventually become enjoyable after repeated exposure, why brand names that you see frequently become preferred choices, even when you know nothing about product quality, and why political candidates who receive more media coverage often win elections, regardless of their actual qualifications or policy positions. Your unconscious mind tracks exposure, frequency, and duration, using this information as a shortcut for determining trustworthiness, safety, and desirability in situations where you lack time or information to make more thorough evaluations. The advertising industry has built entire strategies around exploiting the mere exposure effect, investing billions of dollars in repeated brand exposure through multiple channels, specifically to create positive associations that influence purchasing decisions. The effectiveness of this approach does not depend on memorable or creative advertising content, but simply on ensuring that brand names, logos, and associated imagery appear frequently enough to trigger unconscious familiarity preferences. Similarly, propaganda and political influence campaigns rely heavily on repetition to gradually shift public opinion. Understanding that repeated exposure to particular messages or imagery can create acceptance and preference, even when the content lacks logical persuasive power. Recognizing the mere exposure effect helps you understand how your preferences and choices may be shaped by unconscious familiarity rather than conscious evaluation, making it important to question whether your positive feelings toward something reflect genuine value or simply repeated exposure. 15. Source amnesia and information mix-ups. Source amnesia occurs when your memory retains information while losing track of where that information came from, creating a dangerous vulnerability where unreliable sources become indistinguishable from trustworthy ones in your recollection of facts and beliefs. This separation between content and context happens naturally as time passes and your brain prioritizes storage efficiency over complete accuracy, but it creates significant problems in an information-rich environment where the credibility of sources is crucial for making sound judgments and decisions. When you remember a compelling fact or statistic, but cannot recall whether it came from a rigorous scientific study or a random social media post, your ability to evaluate the reliability of that information becomes seriously compromised. The mechanism behind source amnesia reflects how your memory system processes and stores different types of information through separate pathways. The content of information gets encoded into semantic memory networks that focus on meaning and relationships between concepts, while the contextual details about sources, timing, and circumstances get stored through episodic memory systems that are more vulnerable to decay and interference over time. As weeks and months pass, the vivid details about where and when you encountered specific information gradually fade, while the information itself may remain accessible and seemingly authoritative in your memory. This psychological vulnerability becomes particularly problematic in our current media environment, where misleading information can be packaged to appear as credible as legitimate journalism or scientific research. A fabricated statistic shared through social media can become indistinguishable from official government data once source amnesia has occurred, leading to decisions and beliefs based on completely unreliable information that feels authoritative because you cannot remember its questionable origins. Understanding source amnesia reveals the importance of consciously noting and recording the sources of important information at the time you encounter it, rather than trusting your memory to maintain accurate distinctions between reliable and unreliable sources of information that influence your understanding of the world. 16. The foot-in-the-door technique. The foot-in-the-door technique operates through a fundamental principle of human psychology that connects small commitments to larger ones, creating a psychological pathway that leads people to agree to increasingly significant requests without recognizing how their initial compliance set them up for exploitation. This influence strategy begins with asking for something so small and reasonable that refusing would seem petty or unreasonable, then gradually escalates to larger requests that build upon the foundation of previous agreements. Your mind naturally seeks consistency between your past actions and current decisions, making you far more likely to comply with substantial requests. If you have already agreed to smaller related requests from the same person or organization, the mechanism works because each small agreement creates a subtle shift in how you perceive yourself and your relationship with the requester. When you agree to sign a petition supporting environmental protection, you begin to see yourself as someone who cares about environmental issues and supports that particular cause. This identity shift makes you more receptive when the same organization later asks you to volunteer your time, donate money, or take other actions that align with the environmental identity you have begun to adopt through your initial small commitment. Sales professionals, political campaigners, and charitable organizations have mastered this technique because it bypasses the natural resistance people feel toward large requests by creating a series of small commitments that gradually build momentum. The beauty of this approach lies in how natural and voluntary each step feels to the target, even though the entire sequence has been carefully designed to lead toward a predetermined larger goal that the person might have rejected outright if presented initially. 17. Variable ratio reinforcement addiction. Variable ratio reinforcement creates the most powerful and persistent behavioral patterns known to psychology by delivering rewards on an unpredictable schedule that keeps your brain locked in cycles of anticipation and seeking. Behavior that can override rational decision-making and create genuine psychological addiction. Unlike predictable reward schedules that allow your mind to adjust expectations and potentially lose interest, variable ratio reinforcement exploits your brain's natural response to uncertainty by creating a constant state of hopeful anticipation that generates compulsive behavior patterns remarkably similar to substance addiction in their neurochemical and behavioral characteristics. The power of this reinforcement schedule becomes clear when you consider how gambling machines operate. Each pull of a slot machine lever might result in a small win, a large jackpot, or nothing at all. And this unpredictability creates a powerful psychological hook that keeps players engaged far longer than they would remain interested in a predictable activity. Your brain releases dopamine not just when you win, but in anticipation of potentially winning, creating a chemical reward cycle that reinforces the gambling behavior regardless of overall financial outcomes. This same mechanism appears throughout modern technology and social media platforms that have designed their notification systems, content delivery, and reward structures around variable ratio reinforcement principles. The unpredictable nature of social media, likes, comments, messages, and content recommendations creates addictive usage patterns that override conscious intentions to limit screen time. Dating apps, video games, and even email systems exploit this psychological vulnerability by delivering intermittent rewards that keep users engaged in seeking behaviors long after the rational mind recognizes that the activity provides minimal real value or satisfaction. 18. The McGurk effect of sensory confusion. The McGurk effect demonstrates how your brain constructs reality through the integration of multiple sensory inputs, revealing that what you perceive as objective sensory experience actually results from unconscious processing that combines and sometimes conflicts different streams of information in ways that can create completely false perceptions. This phenomenon occurs when visual information about speech movements conflicts with auditory information about speech sounds, causing your brain to perceive sounds that are not actually present in either the visual or auditory input alone. The effect reveals how perception involves active construction rather than passive recording, showing that your conscious experience of reality depends on complex integration processes that can be easily manipulated or disrupted. When you watch someone's lips forming one syllable while hearing a different syllable through headphones, your brain attempts to resolve this conflict by creating a perception that represents a compromise between the conflicting inputs, often producing a third sound that matches neither the visual nor auditory information perfectly. This integration happens automatically and unconsciously, demonstrating that much of what you experience as direct sensory input actually involves sophisticated processing that combines multiple information sources in ways you never recognize or consciously control. The McGurk effect has important implications for understanding how easily perception can be manipulated and how unreliable, supposedly, objective sensory experience can become when different information sources provide conflicting data. This principle extends beyond laboratory demonstrations into real-world situations where visual and auditory cues might conflict, such as watching dubbed foreign films, video calls with audio delays, or any situation where sensory information becomes degraded or manipulated. Understanding this effect reveals how your perception of reality depends on complex integration processes that create vulnerability to manipulation and error in ways that feel completely natural and undetectable. 19. Authority bias and expert influence. Authority bias creates a powerful psychological shortcut that causes you to accept information and follow directions from perceived experts or authority figures without applying the same critical thinking you would use to evaluate identical information from less credentialed sources. This cognitive bias evolved as a survival mechanism that helped our ancestors quickly identify and follow knowledgeable leaders in dangerous or uncertain situations. But in modern society, it can override your independent judgment and make you vulnerable to manipulation by those who understand how to project authority, regardless of their actual expertise or trustworthiness. The mechanism operates through automatic respect and deference that gets triggered by symbols of authority, such as titles, credentials, uniforms, institutional affiliations, or confident presentation styles that suggest expertise and competence. When someone introduces themselves as a doctor, professor, or expert in a particular field, your mind immediately shifts into a more receptive and less critical mode of processing their statements and recommendations. This shift happens below conscious awareness and can influence your judgment even when you consciously recognize that. Credentials do not guarantee accuracy or honest intentions. This bias becomes particularly dangerous in complex, technical, or specialized domains where you lack sufficient knowledge to evaluate claims independently, making you dependent on authority figures whose motivations and competence you cannot directly assess. Medical professionals, financial advisors, scientific experts, and political leaders all benefit from authority bias that can lead people to accept recommendations or follow guidance that may not serve their best interests. The proliferation of fake credentials, misleading titles, and manufactured expertise in digital media has made authority, BIAS, an increasingly dangerous vulnerability that requires conscious effort to recognize and counteract through independent verification and critical evaluation of claims, regardless of their source. 20. The contrast principle in perception. The contrast principle reveals how your perception and judgment of anything depends heavily on what you experience immediately before or alongside it, rather than being based on absolute or objective evaluation of its inherent qualities. This fundamental aspect of human cognition means that identical experiences, objects, or situations can be perceived as dramatically different depending on the context that surrounds them, making your supposedly objective judgments actually highly malleable and susceptible to manipulation through careful arrangement of comparison standards that shift your frame of reference in predetermined directions. Consider how a moderately attractive person appears more appealing when surrounded by less attractive individuals, or how a reasonable price seems expensive when preceded by exposure to much lower prices for similar items. Your brain constantly uses comparison and contrast to make sense of complex information, but this efficiency mechanism creates systematic vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand how to manipulate context and framing to influence your perceptions and decisions in ways that serve their interests, rather than providing you with accurate information. The contrast principle operates across all domains of human experience, from physical sensations like temperature and brightness to abstract concepts like fairness, value, and quality. Retailers use this principle by displaying expensive items first to make moderately priced items seem reasonable, while negotiators employ contrast by making extreme initial offers that make their actual targets seem more acceptable by comparison. Politicians frame their positions by contrasting them with more extreme alternatives that make moderate positions appear reasonable and centrist. Understanding the contrast principle reveals how easily your judgment can be manipulated through strategic presentation of information that creates artificial reference points designed to influence your conclusions rather than helping you make truly independent evaluations. 21. Flashbulb memories of dramatic events. Flashbulb memories create the illusion of photographic accuracy for dramatic or emotionally significant events, preserving vivid recollections that feel extraordinarily detailed and reliable, but actually contain numerous inaccuracies and distortions that increase over time despite your complete confidence in their authenticity. These memories form during moments of high emotional intensity or personal significance, when your brain's memory encoding systems become hyperactive and create unusually detailed records of not just the central event, but also seemingly irrelevant contextual details, like what you were wearing, where you were standing, or what the weather was like when you received shocking news or witnessed something extraordinary. The compelling nature of flashbulb memories lies in their exceptional vividness and the strong emotional resonance they maintain over long periods, making them feel qualitatively different from ordinary memories and creating powerful conviction that they must be more accurate than typical recollections. Research has consistently demonstrated that despite this subjective certainty, flashbulb memories are just as susceptible to distortion, contamination, and reconstruction as any other memories, gradually shifting and changing each time they are recalled, while maintaining their convincing sense of authenticity and detail. This phenomenon has important implications for eyewitness testimony, personal identity formation, and historical understanding, because traumatic or significant events often become foundational elements in how people understand themselves and their world. The confidence people feel in these vivid memories can make them resistant to correction or alternative perspectives, even when objective evidence demonstrates that their recollections contain significant errors. Understanding flashbulb memories reveals how emotional intensity can create false confidence in memory accuracy, making it essential to remain humble about the reliability of even our most vivid and meaningful recollections. 22. Mirroring and unconscious mimicry. Mirroring operates as an automatic social bonding mechanism that causes you to unconsciously copy the postures, gestures, speech patterns, and even breathing rhythms of people around you, creating psychological rapport and connection that influences how much you like and trust others without any conscious awareness of this imitation process. This unconscious mimicry happens within seconds of interaction and continues throughout social encounters, serving as a fundamental building block of human social coordination that helps establish emotional attunement, empathy, and cooperative relationships that were essential for survival in ancestral social environments. The mechanism works through specialized neural pathways called mirror neurons that automatically activate when you observe others performing actions or expressing emotions, causing your own motor and emotional systems to subtly replicate these patterns, even when you have no intention of mimicking anyone. This creates a form of embodied empathy where you literally experience echoes of others' physical and emotional states through your own nervous system, generating increased understanding, sympathy, and social connection that forms the foundation for complex cooperative behaviors and relationships. Skilled communicators, salespeople, therapists, and leaders often develop conscious awareness of mirroring principles and learn to deliberately match others' communication styles, energy levels, and nonverbal behaviors to create enhanced rapport and influence. However, this same mechanism makes you vulnerable to manipulation by those who understand how to exploit unconscious mimicry to create false impressions of similarity, understanding, and trustworthiness. The automatic nature of mirroring means that you may develop positive feelings toward people who are deliberately copying your behaviors to influence your judgment, even when their underlying motivations or character differ significantly from the surface impression created through strategic mimicry. 23. The availability heuristic in judgment. The availability heuristic causes your brain to estimate probability and frequency based on how easily relevant examples come to mind, creating systematic biases in judgment that overweight recent, memorable, or emotionally significant events while underestimating risks and opportunities that are statistically more likely but less mentally accessible. This cognitive shortcut evolved to help humans make rapid decisions based on limited information. But in modern information environments, it can lead to dramatically skewed risk assessment and poor decision-making that contradicts objective statistical reality and rational analysis of actual probabilities. Your mind naturally assumes that events which are easy to remember or imagine must be more common or likely than events which are difficult to recall, because availability in memory often correlates with actual frequency in the real world. However, media coverage, personal experience, and emotional impact can create massive distortions in mental availability that bear little relationship to actual statistical frequencies. Airplane crashes receive extensive media coverage and create vivid, memorable imagery that makes air travel seem more dangerous than driving. Even though statistical analysis clearly demonstrates that flying is far safer than automobile transportation per mile traveled. This bias affects every area of life where you must assess risks, opportunities, and probabilities without access to comprehensive statistical data. Medical decisions, financial investments, career choices, and relationship judgments all become influenced by the availability heuristic as your mind overweights easily recalled examples while systematically ignoring less memorable but more statistically significant patterns. Understanding this bias reveals the importance of seeking objective data rather than relying on intuitive probability estimates based on mental availability, because what feels most likely often reflects the limitations of human memory and attention rather than actual reality. 24. Behavioral momentum and habit chains. Behavioral momentum describes how ongoing patterns of behavior tend to persist and resist change, much like physical objects in motion that continue moving in the same direction, unless acted upon by external forces strong enough to overcome their inertia. This psychological principle reveals that your current actions strongly predict your future actions, not just because of conscious decision-making, but because established behavioral patterns create their own psychological gravity that makes continuing existing behaviors easier than initiating changes, even when those changes would obviously benefit you in the long run. The mechanism operates through multiple psychological and neurological pathways that reinforce repetition and routine. Neural pathways that control frequently repeated behaviors become increasingly efficient and automatic, requiring less conscious attention and decision-making energy to execute. Environmental cues associated with established behaviors automatically trigger these neural programs without conscious awareness, making habitual responses feel natural and effortless, while alternative behaviors require deliberate mental effort and conscious override of automatic systems. Understanding behavioral momentum explains why changing established patterns can feel so difficult even when you have strong conscious motivation to behave differently, and why small, consistent actions can gradually build into powerful behavioral changes over time. Breaking negative behavioral momentum requires conscious intervention strategies that disrupt automatic patterns and environmental cues, while building positive momentum involves creating consistent small behaviors that gradually establish new neural pathways and environmental associations. The principle also explains why people often return to previous behavior patterns after temporary changes, because the underlying momentum was never fully redirected toward new patterns that could become self-sustaining through repetition and reinforcement. 25. The Mandela Effect Group Delusion. The Mandela effect occurs when large groups of people share identical false memories about historical events, cultural details, or factual information, creating collective delusions that feel completely authentic to those who experience them, despite being contradicted by objective evidence and documented records. This phenomenon demonstrates how social influence and suggestion can create shared false memories that become reinforced through group discussion and mutual validation, making incorrect information feel more reliable and trustworthy than actual facts, simply because multiple people remember the same incorrect details. The effect gets its name from widespread false memories about Nelson Mandela dying in prison during the 1980s, when he actually lived until 2013 after serving as South African president. Many people vividly recall news coverage of his death, funeral ceremonies, and his widow's speeches, complete with emotional reactions and specific contextual details that make these false memories feel absolutely authentic. Similar collective false memories include misremembered movie quotes, corporate logos, geographical locations, and historical events that millions of people remember differently from documented reality. The mechanism behind the Mandela effect involves the interaction of several psychological processes, including source confusion, social validation, confirmation bias, and the reconstructive nature of memory. When someone suggests an alternative version of a remembered event, it can trigger false recognition in others, who then reconstruct their memories to match the suggested version, especially if the suggestion comes from trusted sources or gains social support. The internet has amplified this effect by allowing people with similar false memories to find each other and create communities that reinforce incorrect recollections while dismissing contradictory evidence as conspiracy or cover-up, demonstrating how group dynamics can maintain collective delusions that resist correction through objective information. 26. Priming and subconscious triggers. Priming operates by exposing you to subtle cues that activate specific concepts, emotions, or behavioral tendencies in your mind, influencing your subsequent thoughts, feelings, and actions in ways that feel completely natural and self-determined, even though they result from external manipulation of your psychological state. This influence occurs below conscious awareness through pathways that bypass critical thinking and rational evaluation, making priming one of the most powerful and invisible forms of psychological influence, available to those who understand how to activate specific mental associations and response patterns without triggering conscious resistance or recognition. The mechanism works by temporarily increasing the mental accessibility of particular concepts, memories, or behavioral scripts through exposure to related words, images, sounds, or experiences that create spreading activation throughout your neural networks. When concepts become primed, they influence how you interpret ambiguous information, what memories you recall, what emotions you experience, and what behaviors feel natural or appropriate in subsequent situations, even when hours or days have passed since the original priming exposure occurred. Research has demonstrated that priming effects can influence everything from walking speed and academic performance to consumer preferences and moral judgments through remarkably subtle interventions. Exposure to words related to elderly stereotypes can make people walk more slowly, while priming concepts related to intelligence can improve performance on cognitive tasks. Environmental cues like background music, lighting, scents, and visual imagery all function as priming stimuli that can systematically influence behavior and decision making without conscious awareness. Understanding priming reveals how your supposedly independent thoughts and choices are constantly being shaped by environmental influences that operate through unconscious psychological mechanisms, making awareness of these processes essential for maintaining any degree of cognitive autonomy in environments designed to influence your behavior. 27. The extinction burst phenomenon. The extinction burst phenomenon describes the temporary intensification of unwanted behaviors, that occurs when established reinforcement patterns are suddenly removed, creating a paradoxical situation where attempts to eliminate problematic behaviors initially cause them to become more frequent, intense, or persistent before they finally begin to diminish. This counterintuitive response represents your brain's automatic attempt to restore previously reliable reward systems by increasing the intensity and frequency of behaviors that used to produce desired outcomes, much like pressing a broken elevator button harder and more frequently when it fails to respond normally. Understanding this phenomenon is crucial for anyone attempting to change established behavior patterns, whether in themselves or others, because the initial worsening of unwanted behaviors often discourages people from persisting with effective change strategies. When parents stop giving attention to a child's tantrums, the tantrums typically become worse before they improve, leading many parents to conclude incorrectly that ignoring the behavior is not working and return to previous response patterns that inadvertently reinforce the problematic behavior through intermittent attention. The extinction burst occurs across all types of learned behaviors and can affect everything from addiction recovery and habit change to relationship dynamics and organizational behavior modification efforts. Gamblers often increase their betting when machines stop paying out. Employees may work harder when familiar rewards are removed. And people attempting to break social media habits often experience increased urges and usage before successfully reducing their engagement. Recognizing extinction burst patterns helps maintain commitment to effective change strategies during the difficult initial period when unwanted behaviors temporarily worsen. Understanding that this intensification actually signals that the intervention is working and that persistence will eventually lead to the desired behavioral changes. 28. Framing effects on decision-making. Framing effects demonstrate how the presentation and context of information can completely alter your decisions and preferences, even when the underlying facts remain identical, revealing that your supposedly rational choice process is actually highly susceptible to manipulation through strategic packaging of options and information. The same statistical data risk assessment or set of alternatives can lead to opposite decisions, depending on whether they are framed in terms of gains versus losses, positive versus negative outcomes, or different reference points that shift your perspective on what constitutes a favorable result. Consider how medical treatments appear more attractive when described as having a 90% success rate compared to a 10% failure rate, even though these statistics are mathematically identical. Your brain responds differently to information framed as gains versus losses, with loss framing typically creating stronger emotional responses and risk aversion that can override logical analysis of objective probabilities and outcomes. This asymmetry in how you process positively versus negatively framed information creates systematic vulnerabilities that can be exploited by anyone who understands how to present information in ways that trigger desired responses. Politicians, advertisers, medical professionals, and financial advisors all use framing effects to influence decisions by carefully controlling how information is presented rather than changing the actual content of their recommendations or proposals. Tax policies can be framed as relief for hardworking families or as increased burden on job creators, describing identical legislation from different perspectives that create completely different emotional and political responses. Understanding framing effects reveals the importance of seeking multiple perspectives and reformulating important decisions using different frames to identify how presentation might be influencing your judgment independently of the actual merits of available options. 29. The chameleon effect in social settings. The chameleon effect describes your unconscious tendency to automatically adopt the behaviors, mannerisms, speech patterns, and even emotions of people around you, creating a form of social camouflage that helps you blend into different groups and situations by mirroring the characteristics of your social environment. This automatic behavioral adaptation happens without conscious intention or awareness, operating through mirror neuron systems and social learning mechanisms that evolved to facilitate group bonding, cooperation, and acceptance within the complex social hierarchies that characterized ancestral human communities. The effect manifests in subtle but measurable changes in how you speak, gesture, posture yourself, and express emotions depending on who you are interacting with and what social context you find yourself navigating. Your accent may shift when talking to people from different regions. Your vocabulary becomes more formal or casual depending on professional versus personal settings, and your energy level naturally adjusts to match the mood and pace of surrounding social dynamics without conscious decision-making about appropriate behavioral choices. While the chameleon effect serves important social functions by facilitating smoother interactions and group cohesion, it also reveals how your sense of authentic self may be more fluid and context-dependent than you realize. This automatic adaptation can make you vulnerable to influence from social environments that encourage behaviors or attitudes that conflict with your conscious values, especially in situations where group pressure creates strong incentives for conformity. Understanding the chameleon effect helps you recognize how your behavior naturally adapts to social contexts while maintaining awareness of when these adaptations might be leading you away from your authentic preferences and values, allowing you to make more conscious choices about when to blend in versus when to maintain independent positions. 30. State-dependent learning and context. State-dependent learning reveals how your ability to recall information depends heavily on matching the physical, emotional, and environmental conditions that existed when the original learning occurred, creating context-specific memory networks that can dramatically enhance or impair your access to stored knowledge, depending on how closely current circumstances resemble the original learning situation. This phenomenon demonstrates that memory is not simply a storage and retrieval system, but rather a complex reconstruction process that relies on multiple contextual cues to activate and assemble relevant information from distributed neural networks throughout your brain. Research has demonstrated that people perform significantly better on memory tests when they are in the same physical location, emotional state, or even bodily position that they occupied during original learning, because these contextual elements become integrated into the memory traces and serve as retrieval cues that help activate the complete memory network. Students who study underwater perform better on underwater tests. People who learn word lists while happy recall them better when happy, and information studied in particular rooms or with specific background conditions becomes more accessible when those same conditions are recreated during testing. This principle has important practical implications for education, skill development, and performance optimization. suggesting that learning should occur in contexts that resemble performance situations whenever possible. It also explains why knowledge learned in artificial educational environments sometimes fails to transfer effectively to real-world applications, where contextual cues differ significantly from the original learning situation. Understanding state-dependent learning helps you optimize memory performance by creating rich contextual associations during learning and recreating relevant environmental or psychological conditions when you need to access stored information, while also recognizing how changes in context can temporarily impair access to knowledge that remains intact but context-locked in your memory systems. 31. The reciprocity principle, obligation. The reciprocity principle creates powerful psychological pressure to return favors, gifts, or kindness that others have extended to you, establishing invisible debts that can influence your behavior for months or years after the original gesture occurred. This fundamental social rule operates below conscious awareness, triggering automatic feelings of obligation that can override your rational evaluation of whether reciprocation serves your best interests, or whether the original favor was genuinely altruistic. Understanding this mechanism reveals how strategic generosity can be weaponized to create compliance and influence that far exceeds the actual value of the initial investment. The principle evolved as a crucial component of human social cooperation, enabling complex exchanges and mutual aid that benefited entire communities through networks of reciprocal obligation and support. However, this same mechanism makes you vulnerable to manipulation by those who understand how to trigger reciprocity responses through carefully calculated gestures that appear generous but are actually designed to create disproportionate returns through future compliance or cooperation. Sales professionals exploit reciprocity by offering free samples, gifts, or services that create psychological pressure to purchase products or services in return. Political candidates provide small favors or recognition to constituents who then feel obligated to provide votes or support. Even criminals use reciprocity by performing unsolicited services like cleaning windshields before requesting payments, making refusal feel socially awkward and morally questionable. The reciprocity principle demonstrates how your natural social programming can be hijacked by those who understand the psychological mechanisms that govern human cooperation and obligation, making awareness of these dynamics essential for maintaining autonomy in your social and economic relationships. 32. Confirmation bias and selective thinking. Confirmation bias causes your mind to actively seek information that supports your existing beliefs while avoiding dismissing or reinterpreting information that challenges your established worldview, creating self-reinforcing cycles of certainty that become increasingly resistant to correction through evidence or logical argument. This cognitive bias operates through multiple psychological mechanisms that prioritize psychological comfort and internal consistency over objective truth, making you significantly more likely to notice, remember, and trust information that confirms what you already believe, while systematically overlooking contradictory evidence that might require uncomfortable adjustments to your understanding. The bias manifests in how you select information sources, interpret ambiguous events, remember past experiences, and evaluate the credibility of different perspectives on controversial topics. People with strong political beliefs consume news from sources that align with their existing views, while avoiding outlets that present challenging perspectives, creating information bubbles that reinforce existing opinions rather than providing balanced understanding of complex issues. Search engines and social media platforms have amplified confirmation bias by creating algorithmic filters that show you content similar to what you have previously engaged with, creating personalized information environments that gradually become more extreme and less diverse over time. This technological amplification of natural confirmation bias contributes to political polarization, conspiracy theory acceptance, and resistance to scientific consensus on issues like climate change and vaccination safety. Understanding confirmation bias reveals how your supposedly rational evaluation of evidence is actually biased toward maintaining existing beliefs, making conscious effort to seek contradictory information and alternative perspectives, essential for maintaining intellectual honesty and accurate understanding of complex reality. 33. The serial position effect in memory. The serial position effect demonstrates how your memory for lists or sequences of information varies dramatically depending on where items appear within the overall structure, with items at the beginning and end receiving preferential encoding and recall, while middle items become significantly less accessible over time. This phenomenon reveals fundamental limitations in how your attention and memory systems process sequential information, creating systematic patterns of forgetting that can be predicted and exploited by those who understand how to position important information for maximum retention and impact. The effect operates through two distinct mechanisms that create advantages for different positions within sequences. The primacy effect gives superior memory to early items, because your attention is highest at the beginning of information presentation, and these items receive more rehearsal and deeper processing before competing items begin to interfere with encoding. The recency effect creates enhanced memory for final items because they remain active in short-term memory systems when recall is tested shortly after presentation, avoiding the interference that affects earlier items. Politicians understand serial position effects and strategically position their strongest arguments at the beginning and end of speeches, while burying controversial or weak points in the middle sections that audiences are least likely to remember. Similarly, job interviews, product presentations, and educational materials are often structured to take advantage of primacy and recency effects by placing crucial information in positions that maximize retention and impact. Understanding the serial position effect helps you recognize how the arrangement of information influences what you remember and forget, while also revealing strategies for optimizing your own communication and learning by positioning important material in psychologically advantageous locations within overall information structures. 34. Dorenface persuasion strategy. The Dorenface technique operates by making an intentionally unreasonable or extreme initial request that you are virtually certain to refuse, followed immediately by a more moderate request that becomes your actual target objective. Exploiting psychological principles of contrast and reciprocal concession to dramatically increase compliance rates compared to making the moderate request directly. This counterintuitive approach works because your refusal of the extreme request creates psychological pressure to appear reasonable and cooperative by agreeing to the subsequent, smaller request. which seems moderate and fair by comparison, even though it might be objectively unreasonable when evaluated independently. The technique exploits your natural tendency to interpret the reduction from the extreme request to the moderate request as a concession that deserves reciprocal cooperation on your part. When someone reduces their demand in response to your refusal, your mind automatically frames this adjustment as compromise and flexibility that creates obligation to meet them halfway by agreeing to their revised request. This psychological dynamic operates even when you consciously recognize that the initial extreme request was strategic rather than genuine. Charitable organizations frequently use door-in-face strategies by initially asking for large donations or substantial volunteer commitments that most people will refuse, then following up with smaller requests that seem reasonable by comparison and generate significantly higher compliance rates than direct, modest requests would achieve. Sales professionals, political campaigners, and anyone seeking cooperation or compliance can exploit this technique. By understanding how extreme anchors create contrast effects that make moderate requests appear more attractive and reasonable. Understanding door-in-the-face persuasion reveals how your perception of reasonableness can be manipulated through strategic sequencing of requests that exploit psychological contrast and reciprocity principles. 35. The over-justification effect paradox. The over-justification effect reveals a counterintuitive truth. Providing external rewards for activities that people already find intrinsically enjoyable can actually reduce their internal motivation and long-term engagement with those activities, creating a paradox where attempts to increase motivation through incentives sometimes produce the opposite result by undermining natural interest and satisfaction. This phenomenon occurs when external rewards become interpreted as the primary reason for engaging in an activity, causing your mind to discount the internal satisfaction and personal meaning that originally motivated participation. The mechanism operates through cognitive attribution processes that cause you to reassess why you engage in particular activities when external rewards are introduced. Activities that once felt inherently enjoyable and meaningful become reframed as work or obligation when payment grades or other external motivators are added. Shifting your focus from internal satisfaction to external outcomes that may not provide the same psychological rewards as intrinsic motivation. Educational systems often fall victim to over-justification effects when they rely heavily on grades, rewards, and punishments to motivate learning, potentially undermining students' natural curiosity and love of knowledge by making academic achievement feel like external obligation rather than personal growth and discovery. Similarly, creative pursuits, volunteer activities, and hobbies can lose their appeal when they become monetized or subject to external evaluation that shifts focus from internal satisfaction to external validation. Understanding the over-justification effect reveals the importance of protecting intrinsic motivation by carefully considering when external rewards might be helpful versus harmful, and recognizing that the most sustainable motivation often comes from internal sources of meaning and satisfaction, rather than external incentives that can inadvertently undermine genuine engagement with valued activities. 36. Cryptomnesia and unconscious plagiarism. Cryptomnesia occurs when your memory retrieves information, ideas, or creative expressions that you previously encountered but have forgotten the original source, leading you to unconsciously present borrowed material as your own original thoughts or creations without any deliberate intention to plagiarize or deceive. This phenomenon reveals how your creative and intellectual processes can be influenced by forgotten inputs that resurface as seemingly spontaneous insights, making it difficult to distinguish between genuine originality and unconscious reproduction of previously encountered material that feels completely novel to your conscious awareness. The mechanism operates through source amnesia, where your memory systems retain content while losing track of contextual information about when, where, or how you originally encountered particular ideas, phrases, melodies, or creative elements. When these orphaned memories resurface during creative or intellectual activities, they feel like spontaneous inspirations rather than recalled information, creating genuine, subjective experiences of originality, even though the material actually derives from external sources that have been forgotten. Artists, writers, inventors, and researchers all face potential cryptomnesia challenges, because creative work naturally involves synthesizing influences from numerous sources that may not remain consciously accessible during the creative process. Famous cases of unconscious musical plagiarism have involved successful songs that unknowingly reproduced earlier compositions, while scientific discoveries have sometimes independently rediscovered principles that were previously established but forgotten or overlooked by later researchers. Understanding cryptomnesia reveals the complex relationship between memory, creativity, and originality, highlighting the importance of maintaining awareness of your intellectual influences while also recognizing that perfect originality may be impossible in a world where all creative work builds upon previous cultural and intellectual foundations that shape thinking in both conscious and unconscious ways. 37. Scarcity psychology and perceived value. Scarcity psychology demonstrates how limitations in availability, whether real or artificial, can dramatically increase your desire and perceived value for objects, opportunities, or experiences that might otherwise generate minimal interest or enthusiasm. This fundamental aspect of human psychology evolved from evolutionary pressures, where scarce resources often determined survival, creating automatic responses that equate rarity with importance and urgency. Understanding this mechanism reveals how artificially created scarcity can manipulate your preferences and decision-making by exploiting deep psychological programming that responds to availability cues rather than objective evaluation of actual value or utility. The principle operates through multiple psychological pathways that make scarce items seem more desirable, valuable, and urgently needed than identical items that are readily available. Scarcity triggers competition anxiety, fear of missing out, and status-seeking behaviors that can override rational cost-benefit analysis and lead to impulsive decisions that serve the interests of those creating artificial scarcity rather than your genuine needs or preferences. Marketers routinely exploit scarcity psychology through limited-time offers, exclusive memberships, restricted quantities, and artificial deadlines that create urgency and competition among potential customers. Social media platforms use scarcity principles through temporary content that disappears after viewing, exclusive access to certain features, and notification systems that highlight fleeting opportunities for social connection or content consumption. Dating apps, luxury goods, educational programs, and investment opportunities all commonly use real or manufactured scarcity to increase perceived value and generate demand that exceeds what objective evaluation would justify. Recognizing scarcity psychology helps you distinguish between genuine limitations that affect actual value versus artificial scarcity designed to manipulate your preferences through psychological pressure rather than legitimate considerations of quality, utility, or personal relevance. 38. The planning fallacy and time distortion. The planning fallacy describes your systematic tendency to underestimate the time costs and risks involved in future projects while overestimating their benefits and your ability to complete them according to optimistic projections that ignore potential obstacles, complications, and unforeseen challenges. This cognitive bias affects virtually everyone across all domains of planning, from simple daily tasks to complex long-term projects, creating consistent patterns of disappointment, stress, and failure that result from unrealistic expectations rather than lack of capability or motivation. The bias operates through several psychological mechanisms that create systematic distortions in how you project future scenarios. Optimism bias causes you to focus on best-case outcomes while minimizing attention to potential problems that could delay or complicate your plans. The focusing illusion makes you overweight the importance of factors you are currently considering while underestimating the impact of factors that are not currently salient but may become important later. Additionally, your memory for past planning failures tends to fade more quickly than memory for successful completions, creating skewed reference points for future estimates. Individual planners consistently fall victim to this bias, but organizations and large-scale projects show even more dramatic examples of planning fallacy effects. Construction projects regularly exceed budgets and timelines by substantial margins. Software development consistently takes longer than estimated, and major infrastructure projects often cost several times their original projections. Understanding the planning fallacy reveals the importance of building buffer time and resources into all plans, while seeking outside perspectives that can identify potential complications that your optimistic projections might overlook. Recognition of this bias also helps explain why productivity systems and time management techniques often fail when they rely on unrealistic estimates rather than accounting for the inevitable variations and complications that characterize real-world execution of plans. 39. Interference theory in memory formation. Interference theory explains how new learning can disrupt your ability to recall previously learned information. While old memories can interfere with your acquisition and retention of new material, creating competition between different memory traces that share similar retrieval cues or content characteristics. This phenomenon reveals that memory is not simply a cumulative storage system, where new information gets added without affecting existing knowledge, but rather a dynamic network where memories interact with and influence each other in ways that can enhance or impair overall retention and recall performance. Two types of interference create different patterns of memory disruption. Retroactive interference occurs when new learning impairs your ability to recall information that was previously well established, such as when learning a new phone number makes it harder to remember your old number, or when studying a new language interferes with fluency in your native language. Proactive interference happens when old learning interferes with acquisition of new information. making it difficult to remember new facts that conflict with or resemble previously learned material. The practical implications of interference theory extend to educational strategies, skill development, and professional training programs that must account for how different types of learning interact with each other over time. Scheduling learning sessions to minimize interference. Using distinctive encoding strategies that reduce similarity between competing memories. And understanding when interference might be beneficial versus harmful can significantly improve long-term retention and performance. Medical students learning anatomy, musicians mastering multiple pieces, and language learners acquiring vocabulary all must navigate interference effects that can either support or undermine their learning objectives, depending on how new information relates to existing knowledge structures and how learning experiences are sequenced and organized to optimize, rather than impair, overall memory performance. 40. The sleeper effect in message processing. The sleeper effect demonstrates how persuasive messages from unreliable or untrustworthy sources can actually become more influential over time as your memory for the message content remains accessible, while your memory for the questionable source gradually fades, leaving behind persuasive information that feels increasingly credible as time passes. This counterintuitive phenomenon reveals how the separation of content from context in memory can allow initially dismissed information to gain influence through a process that operates completely outside conscious awareness and can even override your explicit knowledge about source credibility when that information is available. The mechanism operates through the differential decay rates of different types of memory information. Your memory for specific factual claims, statistical data, or persuasive arguments tends to remain relatively stable over time, while your memory for contextual details like source credibility, presentation circumstances, or initial skepticism fades more quickly. This creates situations where compelling information that you initially discounted due to source problems becomes mentally available without the warning signals that originally triggered your critical evaluation. Political campaigns, advertising agencies, and propaganda operations can exploit sleeper effects by widely disseminating compelling but questionable information through sources that people will initially dismiss, knowing that over time the information itself may gain credibility as source memory fades. Social media amplifies sleeper effects by facilitating rapid spread of information across networks, where original sources become obscured through sharing and reposting processes that separate content from context. Understanding sleeper effects reveals the importance of maintaining skeptical evaluation of information, even when it feels compelling and familiar, because the subjective sense of credibility that develops over time may reflect memory processes rather than actual reliability of the original sources that provided the information you now find persuasive. 41. Mental accounting and money categories. Mental accounting describes how your mind creates separate psychological categories for money and resources based on their source, intended purpose, or symbolic, meaning leading to irrational financial decisions that violate basic economic principles but make perfect psychological sense within the arbitrary mental frameworks you use to organize your financial life. This cognitive bias causes identical amounts of money to be treated differently, depending on whether they come from salary, bonuses, gifts, gambling, winnings, or found money, creating systematic inconsistencies in spending and saving behavior. that can significantly impact your long-term financial well-being. The mechanism operates through psychological categorization processes that assign different values and spending rules to money based on factors that are economically irrelevant but psychologically meaningful. People often spend windfall money more frivolously than earned income, treat credit card purchases differently from cash transactions, or maintain separate savings accounts for different goals, while carrying high-interest debt that could be eliminated by combining resources. These mental accounting effects persist even when people consciously recognize their economic irrationality. Understanding mental accounting reveals both the limitations and the potential benefits of how your mind organizes financial decisions. While mental accounting can lead to economically suboptimal choices, it also serves psychological functions by creating meaning, control, and goal-directed behavior that pure economic optimization might undermine. Successful financial planning often works with, rather than against, mental accounting tendencies by creating budgeting systems and savings strategies that align with natural psychological categories while minimizing the most harmful biases. Recognition of mental accounting effects also helps explain why people make seemingly irrational financial choices that actually serve important psychological functions related to identity, security, and meaning that cannot be captured through purely economic analysis of financial decisions. 42. The Garcia effect and taste aversion. The Garcia effect demonstrates how your brain can form powerful aversions to foods or drinks after a single negative experience, even when the illness or discomfort that follows consumption occurs many hours later and may be completely unrelated to what you ate or drank. This phenomenon reveals a specialized learning mechanism that evolved to protect humans from poisonous foods by creating strong avoidance responses that can override rational knowledge about actual causation, generating lasting behavioral changes based on temporal association, rather than logical analysis of cause and effect relationships. The mechanism operates through dedicated neural pathways that monitor the relationship between taste, experiences, and subsequent physical distress, creating automatic associations that bypass normal learning, requirements for immediate reinforcement, and obvious causal connections. Unlike most forms of learning that require multiple repetitions and immediate consequences, taste aversion can develop from a single pairing of flavor and illness that occur many hours apart, demonstrating specialized psychological programming designed specifically for food safety. This biological preparedness explains why people often develop strong aversions to foods they consumed before becoming ill, even when they consciously know that the food was not responsible for their sickness. The effect can create lasting dietary restrictions and preferences that persist for years or decades after the original negative experience, sometimes generalizing to foods with similar tastes, textures, or appearances that trigger the same avoidance responses. Understanding the Garcia effect reveals how evolutionary programming can create learning patterns that conflict with rational analysis, while also explaining why certain types of associations form much more easily than others, depending on their relevance to survival challenges that shaped human holistic psychology over millions of years of evolution in environments where distinguishing safe from dangerous foods was crucial for survival. 43. Social facilitation and performance changes. Social facilitation describes how the presence of others can either enhance or impair your performance, depending on whether you are executing well-learned behaviors versus attempting new or difficult tasks, revealing complex interactions between social pressure, arousal, and skill level that determine whether audiences help or hinder optimal performance. This phenomenon demonstrates that social environments do not simply motivate better performance, but rather create physiological and psychological changes that interact with task demands in ways that can produce dramatically different outcomes depending on your existing competence and confidence levels. The mechanism operates through increased physiological arousal that occurs automatically when you perform in front of others, creating heightened alertness and energy that can facilitate dominant responses while interfering with complex or unfamiliar behaviors that require careful attention and precise control. For simple or well-practiced activities, this arousal enhancement, however, for challenging or novel tasks, the same arousal can create anxiety and distraction that impairs concentration and leads to mistakes that would not occur during solitary practice. Athletes, musicians, public speakers, and performers of all types must navigate social facilitation effects that can either support or undermine their objectives depending on their preparation level and the specific demands of their performance situation. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why some people thrive under social pressure, while others become paralyzed by attention, and why the same individual might excel in familiar performance contexts while struggling with identical skills when attempting more challenging variations in front of audiences. The principle also reveals the importance of matching practice conditions to performance environments and developing strategies for managing arousal levels that optimize rather than interfere with skilled execution under social observation and evaluation. 44. The endowment effect and loss aversion. The endowment effect demonstrates how ownership immediately increases the subjective value you place on objects, making you demand significantly more money to sell something you own than you would be willing to pay to acquire the identical item if you did not already possess it. This valuation asymmetry reflects deeper psychological principles of loss aversion, where your mind experiences losses as roughly twice as psychologically painful as equivalent gains are pleasurable, creating systematic biases in decision-making that prioritize avoiding losses over achieving gains, even when objective analysis would suggest different choices. The mechanism operates through psychological ownership processes that cause you to incorporate possessions into your sense of identity and self-concept, making potential loss feel like personal diminishment rather than simple economic transaction. Once you own something, your reference point shifts so that selling becomes framed as loss rather than gain, triggering loss aversion responses that inflate the psychological value of the item beyond what you would rationally pay to acquire it originally. This bias affects virtually all economic decisions, from major purchases like houses and cars to minor choices about consumer goods, investments, and even relationships where people remain in unsatisfying situations to avoid the psychological pain of giving up what they already have. Real estate agents, retailers, and anyone involved in sales transactions regularly encounter endowment effects that make people reluctant to sell possessions at fair market value, while simultaneously unwilling to pay those same prices for identical items they do not currently own. Understanding the endowment effect reveals how ownership creates psychological anchors that can interfere with rational economic decision, making it important to consciously evaluate whether your attachment to current possessions reflects genuine value or simply loss aversion that prevents optimal resource allocation and life choices. 45. Chunking information for better processing. Chunking represents your mind's fundamental strategy for overcoming the severe limitations of short-term memory by grouping individual pieces of information into larger, more meaningful units that can be processed, stored, and retrieved more efficiently than separate, discrete elements. This cognitive mechanism allows you to handle complex information that would otherwise overwhelm your processing capacity by organizing related details into coherent patterns that function as single units in working memory, dramatically expanding your effective information processing abilities through better organization rather than increased storage capacity. The mechanism operates by exploiting your existing knowledge structures and pattern recognition abilities to identify meaningful relationships among individual information elements that can be combined into higher-order units. Expert chess players can remember entire board positions by recognizing familiar strategic patterns, rather than memorizing individual piece locations. While musicians process complex compositions through harmonic and rhythmic structures rather than individual notes, demonstrating how domain expertise enables increasingly sophisticated chunking strategies. Effective learning and performance in virtually any field depends on developing efficient chunking strategies that allow complex information to be organized into manageable cognitive units that support, rather than overwhelm, working memory capacity. Educational approaches that present information in logical, hierarchical structures. Mnemonic techniques that create meaningful associations between related facts. And practice strategies that gradually build complex skills from simpler components all exploit chunking principles to optimize learning efficiency. Understanding chunking reveals why expertise involves qualitative changes in information processing rather than simply accumulated knowledge, and explains why breaking complex tasks into meaningful subcomponents can dramatically improve learning speed and retention compared to approaches that treat information as disconnected fragments, requiring separate memorization and processing resources. 46. The commitment consistency principle. The commitment consistency principle operates through your deep psychological need to maintain alignment between your stated commitments and subsequent behaviors, creating internal pressure to follow through on promises, agreements, and declarations, even when circumstances change or you discover that your original commitment may not serve your best interests. This fundamental aspect of human psychology evolved to support social cooperation and trust building, but it can also be exploited to lock you into courses of action that benefit others more than yourself through strategic elicitation of commitments that create ongoing behavioral obligations. The mechanism works by creating cognitive dissonance when your actions contradict your stated commitments, generating uncomfortable psychological tension that motivates behavior change to restore consistency between beliefs and actions. Public commitments create additional social pressure through reputation management, concerns that make backing down from stated positions feel costly in terms of credibility and social standing, even when objective analysis suggests that changing course would be more rational. Sales professionals, political campaigners, and influence specialists routinely exploit commitment consistency by securing small initial commitments that create psychological momentum toward larger commitments that align with the original positions people have taken. The technique works even with trivial initial commitments, like agreeing to answer survey questions or expressing support for general principles that later get connected to specific requests for action or compliance. Understanding commitment, consistency, reveals both the benefits and dangers of this psychological mechanism, showing how it supports trustworthy relationships and personal integrity, while also creating vulnerability to manipulation by those who understand how to secure strategic commitments that serve their interests rather than yours. Recognition of these dynamics helps you make more conscious decisions about when to commit versus maintaining flexibility, and how to evaluate whether your desire to maintain consistency is serving genuine values or simply psychological comfort. 47. Survivorship bias in success stories. Survivorship bias creates systematic distortions in your understanding of success, risk, and effective strategies by focusing attention on positive outcomes while overlooking the failures, setbacks, and unsuccessful attempts that may actually represent more typical results of the same approaches and circumstances. This cognitive bias occurs because success stories are more visible, memorable, and widely shared than failure stories, creating misleading impressions about the likelihood of positive outcomes and the effectiveness of particular strategies or decisions that may actually carry significant risks or low success rates. The mechanism operates through selective visibility and reporting that naturally emphasizes positive outcomes, while allowing negative outcomes to disappear from view through lack of attention, documentation, or promotional value. Successful entrepreneurs write books and give speeches about their strategies, while failed entrepreneurs typically do not publicize their approaches or outcomes, creating library shelves full of success advice that represents only the tiny percentage of attempts that achieved positive results. This bias affects virtually every domain where you try to learn from the experiences of others, from investment strategies and career choices to relationship advice and health interventions. The business magazines, motivational speakers, and success gurus that provide most readily available guidance about achievement and performance represent the survivors of processes that may have much lower success rates than their visibility suggests. Understanding survivorship bias reveals the importance of actively seeking information about failures, setbacks, and negative outcomes when evaluating strategies or making decisions based on other people's experiences. This perspective helps you develop more realistic expectations about risks and timelines, while avoiding overconfidence in approaches that may appear more reliable than they actually are, when the complete picture of attempts and outcomes is considered, rather than just the successful cases that receive disproportionate attention and documentation. 48. The testing effect and memory strengthening. The testing effect demonstrates how retrieving information from memory through quizzes, practice tests, or active recall exercises creates stronger and more durable learning than passive review methods like rereading, highlighting, or repeated exposure to the same material. This phenomenon reveals that memory strength depends not just on initial encoding quality, but also on the frequency and effort involved in retrieval practice. With each successful recall attempt, creating additional neural pathways that make future retrieval easier and more reliable, even under challenging conditions. The mechanism operates through the principle that memory traces become stronger through active use, similar to how physical exercise strengthens muscles through repeated activation under resistance. When you actively retrieve information from memory, you strengthen the neural connections that support that knowledge, while also creating additional retrieval routes that provide backup pathways when primary associations become blocked or unavailable due to stress, distraction, or competing information. Educational research consistently demonstrates that students who engage in frequent low-stakes testing perform better on final examinations than students who spend equivalent time in passive review activities. Even though testing often feels more difficult and less pleasant than simply reviewing notes or textbooks, the testing effect explains why flashcards, practice problems, and self-quizzing are among the most effective study strategies available, while also revealing why cramming and passive review methods that feel easier in the moment often fail to produce lasting learning that transfers to new situations. Understanding this principle helps optimize learning efficiency by emphasizing active retrieval practice over passive review, while also explaining why immediate performance during learning sessions may not predict long-term retention that depends more on the quality and frequency of retrieval practice than on initial ease of acquisition. 49. Peripheral root processing shortcuts. Peripheral root processing occurs when your mind evaluates messages and makes decisions based on superficial cues like source credibility, presentation style, or emotional appeal, rather than carefully analyzing the actual content, logic, or evidence presented in the communication. This cognitive shortcut becomes activated when you lack motivation, time, or ability to engage in thorough evaluation, leading to judgments based on contextual factors that may be irrelevant to the actual merits of the information or proposals being presented, making you vulnerable to influence through packaging rather than substance. The mechanism operates through heuristic processing that uses easily accessible cues as substitutes for more demanding analytical evaluation. When faced with complex information that would require significant cognitive effort to evaluate properly, your mind automatically shifts to peripheral processing that focuses on factors like speaker attractiveness, institutional affiliation, consensus indicators, or emotional resonance that can be assessed quickly without deep thought or extensive knowledge about the topic being discussed. Politicians, advertisers, and persuasion specialists routinely exploit peripheral root processing by investing heavily in presentation factors like professional appearance, impressive credentials, celebrity endorsements, and emotional appeals that influence attitudes without requiring strong logical arguments or compelling evidence. This approach becomes particularly effective in situations where audiences are distracted, tired, or overwhelmed by information volume that makes careful analysis impractical. Understanding peripheral root processing reveals the importance of consciously engaging analytical thinking when making important decisions. Recognizing that your initial impressions may reflect superficial presentation factors rather than actual merit or value. This awareness helps you identify when you might be relying on shortcuts rather than substance, allowing you to deliberately engage more thorough evaluation processes when the stakes justify the additional mental effort required for central root processing that focuses on actual content quality and logical strength. 50. The reminiscence bump in life memories. The reminiscence bump describes how your memory contains a disproportionate number of vivid, detailed recollections from adolescence and early adulthood, roughly between ages 15 and 25, creating a peak in autobiographical memory that persists throughout your entire lifespan, regardless of how many decades have passed since those formative years. This phenomenon reveals how memory formation interacts with developmental processes, identity formation, and novelty detection in ways that make certain periods of life permanently more accessible and influential in shaping your sense of self and personal history than other periods that may have contained equally significant events. The mechanism operates through several converging factors that make adolescence and early adulthood particularly memorable. This period typically involves numerous first experiences, major life transitions, and identity-forming events that receive enhanced encoding due to their novelty and personal significance. Additionally, the cognitive and neurological development occurring during these years creates optimal conditions for memory formation, while the identity exploration characteristic of this life stage makes experiences more self-relevant and emotionally significant. The reminiscence bump helps explain why music, fashion, political events, and cultural phenomena from your teenage years and early 20s tend to maintain special emotional resonance throughout your life, often feeling more meaningful and influential than objectively more significant events from other periods. Understanding this memory bias reveals how your sense of personal identity and life narrative may be disproportionately shaped by experiences from a relatively narrow age range that receives privileged status in autobiographical memory. This awareness can help you recognize when reminiscence bump effects might be creating nostalgia or resistance to change that reflects memory accessibility rather than objective evaluation of past versus present circumstances, while also explaining why different generations often seem to inhabit fundamentally different cultural worlds, defined by the formative experiences that occurred during their respective reminiscence bump periods. 51. Selective attention and information filtering. Selective attention operates as a powerful filtering mechanism that determines what information from your environment reaches conscious awareness while automatically screening out competing stimuli that could overwhelm your limited processing capacity. This fundamental cognitive process allows you to focus on relevant information while ignoring distractions. But it also creates systematic blind spots that can cause you to miss important details that fall outside your current focus of attention. The mechanism works through both voluntary and automatic processes that prioritize certain types of information based on current goals, emotional significance, novelty, and learned patterns of attention. While selective attention enables functional behavior in complex environments, your conscious experience represents only a tiny fraction of available environmental information, with the selection process influenced by factors you may not consciously control or recognize. The classic demonstration involves asking people to count basketball passes while a person in a gorilla suit walks through the scene, with many viewers completely failing to notice the obvious but task-irrelevant gorilla. This reveals how attention focused on one aspect of a situation can create complete blindness to other aspects that might be objectively more important. Understanding selective attention helps explain everything from traffic accidents caused by distracted driving to security vulnerabilities that result from focused attention on expected threats while missing unexpected dangers. 52. The Premack Principle Activity Rewards. The Premack Principle demonstrates how high-probability behaviors can serve as effective rewards for increasing the frequency of low-probability behaviors. creating natural motivation systems based on activity preferences rather than external incentives or punishments. This behavioral principle reveals that reward value depends on relative preference rather than absolute characteristics, making preferred activities function as powerful reinforcers. The mechanism operates through the principle that access to preferred activities becomes inherently rewarding when made contingent upon completion of less preferred activities, creating natural motivation that aligns with existing preference structures. For example, allowing yourself to check social media only after completing work tasks or watching television only after exercising harnesses natural activity preferences to support behavioral goals. This principle explains why effective habit formation often involves linking desired new behaviors with established enjoyable routines, rather than trying to motivate new behaviors through abstract goals or external rewards. Parents use this principle when they require children to finish homework before playing video games, while fitness enthusiasts might allow themselves to listen to favorite podcasts only during exercise sessions. Understanding the Premack principle reveals how existing preferences can become tools for behavioral change. 53. Misinformation effect and memory corruption. The misinformation effect occurs when information encountered after an event alters your memory of that event, often making you remember details that never actually happened or changing your recollection of what you originally witnessed. This phenomenon demonstrates how memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, with new information seamlessly integrating into existing memories in ways that feel completely natural and authentic, even when they create significant distortions of actual events. The mechanism operates through memory reconstruction processes that blend original experiences with subsequently encountered information, creating composite memories that combine elements from multiple sources. Without maintaining clear distinctions about what came from direct experience versus later suggestions. Each time you recall a memory, it becomes temporarily malleable and susceptible to influence from current context, emotions, and new information that gets incorporated into the memory trace. Legal proceedings have been particularly affected by misinformation effects, as leading questions, media coverage, and discussions with other witnesses can systematically alter eyewitness recollections in ways that feel authentic to those experiencing the changes. Therapeutic settings can also generate misinformation effects when suggestive questioning or interpretive techniques influence how patients remember childhood experiences or traumatic events. Understanding the misinformation effect reveals how easily memory can be contaminated by external influence, making careful documentation of original experiences important when accuracy matters, and highlighting the limitations of memory as evidence. 54. The elaboration likelihood model. The elaboration likelihood model describes two distinct pathways through which persuasive messages influence attitudes and decisions, with central root processing involving careful evaluation of arguments and evidence, while peripheral root processing relies on superficial cues like source credibility or emotional appeal to determine response without deep analysis of content quality or logical strength. The model explains when people engage thorough versus superficial evaluation based on motivation and ability to process information carefully. High motivation and cognitive ability lead to central root processing that focuses on argument quality, evidence strength, and logical consistency. Low motivation or limited cognitive resources result in peripheral processing that uses shortcuts like expert endorsement, social proof, or attractive presentation to guide judgments without extensive thought. Understanding this model reveals why the same persuasive message can succeed or fail depending on audience characteristics and presentation context. Complex technical information requires audiences with sufficient expertise and motivation to engage central processing, while emotional appeals and celebrity endorsements work through peripheral routes that bypass analytical evaluation. Advertisers exploit this by using central route appeals for involved consumers who research purchases carefully, while relying on peripheral cues like brand recognition and social proof for low-involvement decisions. Recognition of these processing routes helps you identify when you might be using shortcuts rather than thorough evaluation for important decisions. 55. Stimulus generalization response patterns. Stimulus generalization occurs when responses learned in relation to one specific stimulus automatically extend to similar stimuli, creating broader behavioral patterns that can either support adaptive functioning or create problematic reactions to harmless situations that resemble past negative experiences. This fundamental learning mechanism allows efficient application of past learning to new situations without requiring completely separate learning trials for every slightly different circumstance. The mechanism operates through similarity detection processes that identify shared features between current situations and past experiences, automatically triggering responses that were appropriate for previous contexts, but may or may not be suitable for current circumstances. The strength of generalization depends on the degree of similarity between stimuli, with more similar situations producing stronger generalization effects than distant resemblances. Phobias often develop through stimulus generalization. When fear responses to specific traumatic experiences extend to related but harmless situations. Someone attacked by a large dog might develop fear responses to all dogs, or even other four-legged animals that share physical characteristics with the original threat. Similarly, positive generalizations can create beneficial responses when learning from successful experiences transfers to related situations that share relevant features. Understanding stimulus generalization helps explain both adaptive learning transfer and maladaptive fear responses, while revealing how past experiences continue to influence current reactions through automatic patterns. Recognition processes that may not distinguish between truly dangerous versus merely similar situations. 56. The contrast effect in behavioral responses. The contrast effect demonstrates how your behavioral responses to any situation depend heavily on what you experienced immediately before, with previous experiences creating reference points that determine whether current circumstances feel rewarding, punishing, or neutral, regardless of their objective characteristics. This phenomenon reveals how adaptation and comparison processes shape your subjective experience in ways that can be systematically influenced through strategic sequencing of events or experiences. The mechanism operates through neural adaptation processes that adjust baseline expectations and response thresholds based on recent experience, making identical stimuli feel different depending on the context that precedes them. Water feels cold after being in hot weather, but warm after exposure to freezing temperatures, demonstrating how physical sensations depend on contrast rather than absolute conditions. This principle extends to complex behaviors and emotional responses, where satisfaction, motivation, and performance all depend on contrast effects that compare current circumstances to recent reference points. Employees who receive modest raises feel satisfied or dissatisfied, depending on what colleagues received, while students react to grades based on their expectations and previous performance rather than absolute achievement levels. Understanding contrast effects reveals how satisfaction and motivation can be influenced through managing reference points and expectations rather than only changing objective conditions. 57. Shaping behavior through small steps. Shaping involves gradually modifying behavior by reinforcing successive approximations toward a desired target behavior. Breaking complex behavioral changes into manageable increments that build momentum through accumulated small victories rather than requiring dramatic transformations that often fail due to their overwhelming scope. This technique exploits natural learning processes that respond better to gradual progression than abrupt changes, making it possible to achieve significantly behavioral modifications that would be impossible to accomplish through direct approaches. The mechanism operates by identifying intermediate steps that move progressively closer to the ultimate behavioral goal, reinforcing each step until it becomes established before introducing the next level of difficulty or complexity. This creates a pathway of achievable challenges that maintain motivation and confidence while gradually building the skills and habits necessary for more advanced behavioral changes. Animal trainers use shaping to teach complex tricks by rewarding small movements toward desired positions, then gradually requiring more precise or complete versions before providing reinforcement. Human behavior change often succeeds through similar approaches, such as exercise programs that begin with short, easy workouts and gradually increase intensity and duration, or study habits that start with brief sessions and slowly extend to longer periods. Understanding shaping reveals why gradual approaches often succeed where dramatic change attempts fail, and how breaking overwhelming goals into manageable steps creates sustainable progress toward significant life improvements. 58. Intermittent reinforcement schedule power. Intermittent reinforcement creates the strongest and most persistent behavioral patterns by delivering rewards on unpredictable schedules that maintain high levels of engagement and effort, even during extended periods without reinforcement. This schedule proves more powerful than continuous reinforcement, which can lead to rapid extinction when rewards stop, because uncertainty about when the next reward will arrive keeps motivation high and prevents the discouragement that might result from predictable non-reward periods. The mechanism exploits natural responses to uncertainty that evolved to maintain foraging and survival behaviors in environments where resources were available but unpredictable. Your brain releases dopamine not just when rewards arrive, but in anticipation of potentially receiving rewards, creating excitement and motivation that persists through periods of non-reward, as long as occasional reinforcement maintains hope for future success. Gambling represents the most obvious example of intermittent reinforcement, with slot machines and other games designed to provide occasional wins that maintain playing behavior despite overall losses. Social media platforms use similar principles through unpredictable notifications, likes, and messages that create addictive usage patterns. Relationship dynamics can also involve intermittent reinforcement, when inconsistent affection or attention creates stronger attachment than reliable, positive treatment. Understanding intermittent reinforcement helps recognize when unpredictable rewards might be creating unhealthy behavioral patterns, while also revealing how strategic inconsistency can maintain motivation for positive behaviors when used appropriately. 59. Behavioral economics and irrational choices. Behavioral economics reveals how your decision-making systematically deviates from rational economic models, incorporating psychological factors like emotions, cognitive biases, and social influences that create predictably irrational patterns in financial and life choices. This field demonstrates that human behavior often contradicts basic economic assumptions about rational self-interest. Instead, following psychological principles that evolved for different environments and may not serve modern economic interests. These deviations from rationality include loss aversion that makes losses feel twice as painful as equivalent gains feel pleasurable. Present bias that overweights immediate rewards compared to future benefits, and social comparison effects that make relative wealth more important than absolute wealth for happiness and satisfaction. Mental accounting creates arbitrary categories for money that lead to economically inconsistent spending patterns, while availability bias causes overestimation of unlikely risks that receive media attention. Traditional economics assumed perfect rationality and complete information, but behavioral economics incorporates actual human psychology to explain why people make choices that seem illogical from pure economic perspectives. Understanding these patterns helps explain everything from retirement, planning failures, and consumer debt accumulation to market bubbles and investment mistakes. Recognition of behavioral economic principles allows for better personal financial decisions, while also revealing how markets, policies, and institutions can be designed to work with, rather than against, natural human psychology to achieve better outcomes for individuals and society. 60. The threshold of subliminal influence. The threshold of subliminal influence represents the boundary between conscious and unconscious perception, where stimuli, too brief, quiet, or subtle for conscious detection, can still influence thoughts, emotions, and behaviors through pathways that bypass critical evaluation and rational decision-making. This phenomenon reveals a concerning vulnerability in human consciousness, where external influences can shape internal experiences without awareness, creating potential for manipulation that operates entirely outside conscious control or resistance. Research has demonstrated that images flashed for milliseconds, words embedded in background audio below hearing thresholds, and subtle environmental cues can influence subsequent judgments, preferences, and behaviors, even when subjects have no memory of encountering these stimuli. The effects may be small and temporary, but their invisibility makes them particularly insidious, because they cannot be consciously evaluated or resisted through normal critical thinking processes. The advertising industry has long been interested in subliminal techniques, though dramatic claims about their power are often exaggerated. However, the basic principle remains valid. Your mind can be influenced by stimuli below conscious awareness thresholds, making you vulnerable to manipulation through channels you cannot consciously monitor or control. Understanding subliminal influence highlights the importance of recognizing that your thoughts, preferences, and decisions may not be as independent as they feel, and that maintaining awareness of potential unconscious influences becomes essential for preserving cognitive autonomy in environments designed to shape behavior through both conscious and unconscious psychological mechanisms.